source for any of this material. It's not totally clear to me what the motivation for that is. I think that Kushner has some just sort of generic business person sense that marketplaces are more efficient than top-down bureaucracies in distributing, in figuring out where the best place to send stuff is. So there's a kind of an ideological component, but I also think that there's part of him and his worldview and Trump's worldview too that resents any independent operator from making plans on their own. So, Trump really would prefer to have Andrew Cuomo kind of sycophantically thanking the federal government for their support and their help, rather than going outside of the federal system and buying the stuff on his own in the way that, the governors of Massachusetts and Michigan and a few other places have.
But wouldn't that happen if the federal government was actually coordinating all this stuff and saying, like, here it is, we're going to, to me, it just sounds like the first part where it's ideological, that is reinforced by everybody that surrounds that administration, the Heritage Foundation, whatever resources come in through Mike Pence and whatnot. And so the only thing they hear in there is that, like, it's almost as if, the scene where, the gates are being stormed at the castle and all the best fighters just circle around the prince. And they're like, we're willing to give up the entire city as long as we keep the prince safe. And the idea is, like, that's the market. And there's the ideology. And then I think, like, the added thing from Trump and Kushner is just like, and while we protect the market for, ideological and also political, reasons reinforced around us, we want a taste. Like, there's no way they don't have people close to them who are not profiting off of this. Like, I keep thinking about that Politico story of the former Republican fundraiser who, like, just 2 weeks after this hit, gave up political fundraising and sent a letter to everybody. Says, like, I'm now in the medical supply business. And he was boasting about having 100 million, access to 100 million masks. And the reporter asked him, like, how's that? And he goes, well, relationships. You don't develop those relationships in 2 weeks unless somebody has given you the apparatus. And nobody's going to just give you the apparatus unless they're getting a kickback.
Yeah, again, I think we're very far from having a full picture of exactly how all this is unfolding and who's benefiting. But I basically share your perspective. That the story that I think a lot about is the one about the guy who tweeted at Trump that he could supply, some I think it was tens of millions of ventilators, and got I think it was $69 million contract from New York State to supply them, and hasn't supplied a single one. And he's not a ventilator manufacturer. So, there are going to be examples of that kind of, kickback economy, banana republic management, throughout as we go forward and start investigating what happened in the past. I think probably some of that is inevitable when you're trying to move really quickly and are unprepared for a pandemic of this scale. But it's obviously the case that, like, if there was a pandemic response team, they would be able to manage it down somewhat. So there were fewer of those instances. Right. And if the people running the response as it exists actually had the well-being of the country at heart rather than the sort of short-term political interests of the president at heart, similarly, we'd be seeing a much better run show. And one of the tragedies of this is, it's a small tragedy, but the former head of the FDA, Scott Gottlieb, has been one of the most, I think he's been quite impressive, responsible. He's a conservative. He was the head of the FDA under Trump, so he, to a certain degree, is a Trumpist. But he is one of the most reliable voices on the state of the pandemic and what needs to be done out there. He's now a fellow at AEI. And he was forced out of the FDA because he had an opposition to, he had sort of skepticism about vaping. And this is, for weird biographical reasons, a pet cause of Grover Norquist's. Grover Norquist is an avid vaping lobbyist, in addition to being, because of his position on taxation, a kind of a godfather of the modern GOP. And that, so it couldn't fly that the head of the FDA had a problem with vaping. And so Scott Gottlieb is out of the job. We haven't heard from the new head of the FDA during all of this, but Gottlieb is like exactly the kind of person, if you had to deal with a Trump administration at all, that you'd want running the show. And he's unfortunately just writing from the sidelines.
I mean, I don't know how people and people should check out Gottlieb, because I agree with your assessment that he is a voice of reason in this. And he had actually an interesting piece in the Times about sort of what a new normal would look like in terms of living with this, which these are the type of voices that, you know, every time I've spoken to someone like an epidemiologist or whatnot, they're like, these are the kind of conversations we should be having at a national level. But that story that the guy is taken out because of vaping is, and incidentally, when it's been reported that when Alex Azars called Trump in mid-January to talk about it after weeks of trying to get in touch with him about coronavirus, the only thing that Trump was concerned about was the vaping at that time. And I mean, that's just bat crap crazy. Excuse I guess the pun in terms of coronavirus. But so let's talk a little bit about the timeline and just to wrap this up. You wrote about how the models have been all over the place and you know how the perspective on these models have changed. Apparently, the New York Times just came out with a piece saying that new projections from the CDC in documents obtained by the Times shows a steady rise in the number of cases and deaths from COVID-19 over the next several weeks, reaching about 3,000 daily deaths on June 1st. And about 200,000 new cases each day by the end of the month. This has got to be a function of the relaxation that is happening and like my understanding is that right now, if you take New York out of the equation for a moment, that we're actually on a trajectory going up across the country. It's only New York that is creating the sense that our rate of infection and death is going down because so much of the first wave was all about New York. I mean, it seems to me that, you know, there's all these like models that are difficult to sort of capture, like how, you know, will that dude down the street be an a-hole and go out and not wear a mask because he's not worried about it. And like, we don't have a way of modeling that. The only thing we could really do is like sort of look and go like, okay, we're at 15, 20% infection rate in New York. Almost 20,000 people have died. Times it by 3, 60,000 people have to die in New York to get even close to herd immunity. But then like, we don't know what happens if a bunch of people from, you know, I don't know, Georgia come up and, you know, go to Broadway and, you know, whatever. Like, how do we get a sense of what the timeline's going to be here? Because there really feels like we don't understand as a society that the virus has not changed. The only thing that we did was just make sure that we could sort of somehow balance our medical capacity to deal with it in terms of just like sheer not our medical system falling apart. Nobody seems to like sort of get that.
Yeah, I mean, and that is a not insignificant achievement given where we started. You know, when we looked at in Lombardy in Italy, their hospital system was totally overwhelmed. We've managed to avoid that. My guess is that we will manage to avoid that forever in the U.S., and that's really good news. But when we started this lockdown, I think most people thought it was going to last like a couple weeks. But the truth is, you know, unless we have one of three, there are three things that could really bring about the end of this epidemic. The first is a vaccine. The absolute earliest it seems that that's likely is sometime in the fall, and most more sober assessments suggest that it could be more than a year away. We could have some kind of breakthrough treatment, which would make it, you know, a much less lethal, much less severe disease. But at the moment, we're only able to put into trial drugs that were developed to treat other diseases. And it's unlikely that any of those are sort of miracle cures. We've seen, you know, remdesivir, the FDA is now approving, even though there's really limited evidence that it helps in any meaningful way. It doesn't change the mortality rate. It may shorten the duration of the disease for people who would have recovered already, but this isn't a major breakthrough. And yet it's basically the most exciting, promising drug that we have. In order to develop a new drug that really deals with coronavirus itself, is going to take much, much, much longer than that. The third thing that could end the pandemic is, as you mentioned, herd immunity, which is requires at least 60% and possibly 80% of the population to get this disease. And most even generous estimates of how many people have been infected to this point are only as high as 5%. So we're very, 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 very far in America from getting to herd immunity. Now, it's possible that through a mass testing regime, especially combined with contact tracing, that we could live something more like normal lives without producing a kind of exponential growth of the disease like we had in March. That's possible, but we've done so little to prepare for that. We haven't used the 6 weeks that we've been in lockdown to build out that kind of system, which means that now that we're reopening basically in the same situation that we were when we closed down. Cases have nationally basically stabilized, but they've stabilized at a very high level. So 2,000 people a day are dying now, roughly. And if by June, the Trump administration expects that 3,000 people are dying a day, that is growth. But it's actually not that far from where we are today. It's just that we've sort of defined almost as normal this level of dying that a few months ago would have seemed absolutely horrifying to us. It does, we're approaching 9/11 every day now. And that is absolutely horrific. The likelihood that this continues, I think, for a prolonged, protracted period of time is very, very high. I don't think that there's much chance, at least in the medium term, that we'll be able to reduce the number of cases or deaths at all dramatically. And maybe starting in the fall or so, we'll have some helpful treatments that make it considerably less scary as a disease. But I'm not sure that we can count on that, which means it may be the case that we're doing some amount of social distancing / periodic lockdown for a period of a year or maybe even longer. There's a paper in Science suggesting it could run through 2022. So we're not just talking about dealing with this through the presidential election. We could be talking about dealing with this through the midterms. If we don't, and there are things we can do to make that easier. And I also think the science is unclear just how much additional benefit we get from the true shelter-in-place lockdowns beyond what we get from social distancing and closing of large-scale events and better hygiene. It may be that we get most of the benefit from doing those things and through kind of commonsensical, how we interact with one another changes, and we don't need to disappear into our apartments and our houses for 6 weeks at a time again. But the disease itself is going to be as scary, I think, in September as it is today, not less scary. And we have done very, very little to prepare for that outcome, despite now having, depending on how you count, 5 months since the disease was really announced in China, and almost 2 months since America as a whole has been basically sheltering in place. Theoretically, we could have done an enormous amount in that time, and we've practically speaking done nothing. So I think we're in for a long haul.
David Wallace-Wells, we will put a link to your pieces in New York Magazine. Thank you for your time today. Appreciate it. Wish you had some better news, but maybe next time.
Yeah, same here. Great to talk to you again.
Bye-bye. All right, folks. Well, that's basically one half of the equation. The other half of the equation is, what will our society, we've talked about what our society is and is not and can and might do in terms of the medical reality. The other half of the equation is, what will our society do in terms of its political response? And its political response in this instance is going to implicate the well-being of people in a way that I think, we just don't normally see. Right now we're still, I think, we have now 7% of the population is taking basically some type of break from paying their mortgages. We don't have data yet on how many people are doing the same with rent. Mortgages, there is a forbearance program. we do not have that as it stands for rent. Although I guess arguably in New York we have